This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And I'm joined by Dr. Becca Block, a former writing professor and current educational nonprofit executive, who is also the author and researcher of the book, Can You Help Me Give an SHIT? Becca, it is wonderful to have you on The Politics Guys.
Thank you so much for being here. And I just want to point out that the I is not actually in the title, Trey. I was trying to be respectful, even as I pulled from a student quote. So it's SH*T.
Listen, I'm going to be honest with you. If I tried to say that word, I would fail. And so this is me trying to dodge a bullet, literally. No, that's a fair and important point. I also want to point out for listeners that Dr. Block, Becca here, she is a longtime friend of mine. We actually worked when I say that she's a former writing professor, we were both professors at Daytona State College back in Central Florida, which now is many years ago.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, like going on a decade, if we can believe it. And obviously, as listeners, you know, I am now based out of Oklahoma City and Oklahoma Christian University. But of course, Becca and I have remained close. And so I've been really excited. I actually got to see, early versions of the book. And so I'm really excited to get to share that with all of our Politics Guys listeners. So I just want to put that out there. And so if I give Becca a harder time than I other do people, it's out of love. Let's just be aware of that at the outset. So Becca, why don't you just kind of start by telling us what is this? I mean, that is a bombastic title, and as you point out, it actually comes from a student interview. What is this book? What is it about? Give us the quick rundown.
Yeah. So this book, the subtitle helps explain it a little bit better, Unlocking Teen Motivation in School and Life. And what it basically is inspired by is several years ago, one of my colleagues was teaching a class, and she had handed out to all of her students the opportunity to sort of fill out a sheet and say, hey, what do you want to get out of this class? Because it was a kind of more open executive functioning, life skills, study skills, student belonging, kind of open mixture class. And one of the students wrote back, can you help me give a blank about high school? I want to, but I just don't know how. And she had come to myself and one of my other colleagues. Both of these educators are drawn from in the book itself when I give ideas and tips from experienced practitioners. She came to both of us and said, how can I help this young person? And that started a conversation. And one of the things that I noticed when we started looking at some of the resources available for educators and parents who really want to be able to help young people care about school, feel engaged in school, see the point in school, is how often those conversations are told exclusively from the expert perspective, where it's all about what do experts in psychology or education have to say about what you should be doing, with the occasional anecdote thrown in for color from students' experiences to illustrate the perspective of the educators. And it really bothered me. I really feel like that when you spend any time working with young people, you start to learn how thoughtful and intelligent and interesting and different their perspective is than those of us that have been kicking around for a few decades or more. I don't want to date myself, although you already did at the beginning, Trey. Thank you so much.
Listen, that could have been your first job. Nobody knows.
Right. Yes, totally. Right out of undergrad, I somehow became a professor. So anyways, that really bothered me. And I started talking with young people to ask them how they addressed that issue informally at first. And they were giving me such interesting answers that I thought, this should actually be gathered together, right? And so that's when I started to conduct formal interviews with young people around the country. And the first formal interview I conducted happened to end up being with a young woman who is an undergraduate at Penn. She would be here today if she could, but she is in the midst of finals week. It is crazy town there. And she ended up becoming my co-author because she had a minor in journalism and was really interested in some overlapping topics. So that's the kind of origin story of the book and what it's about.
Yeah, and one of the things that kind of fascinated me about that you highlighted there, Becca, was this idea that you wanted to talk with students themselves in those pieces, because you don't get that frequently. I mean, even as a faculty member, the amount that we're going to get of a student's point of view is kind of really terrible teacher evaluations with almost zero real feedback, but we'll put that to the side for a second. And what brought me to want you to have you on the show is that I thought that their perspectives, they have some policy in there, even if they don't always recognize it. You can't help but from being on our side thinking about the kind of the policy implications of that, and that's what really what got me to think I think we need to do this book on the show, was thinking through the narratives of these students and start your book really kind of talking about all the different ways that we're not just pulling the young people in question from your qualitative interviews, but also the different ways that we're pulling schools. And you put it this way, you say, it's not surprising that so many adults and young people alternate between hair-pulling stress and overwhelmed apathy because of all the different ways we're pulling on this. And so I guess I just want to start you by asking, even the way you set up this question, are we asking too much of our schools right now?
Yeah. My personal opinion is probably, right? What I really was interested in was to get a feel from young people as to what allowed them to engage with school when they could. And seeing the patterns there left me in a place as an educator and as a parent and as just sort of a researcher and like citizen in general, going, what do we actually agree as a society about what it is that school is supposed to be for? Because it became very clear to me that what young people were expecting school to accomplish is not the same as what I heard parents talking about that they were expecting school to accomplish, is not the same as what I hear educators talking about they think school is for and the job that they're being asked to do. And not a lot of overlap with then policy of what legislators talk about what school is supposed to do. And I think that's a real problem because it's where we are at. Our children are being raised significantly by school, right? And around school, as a parent, a lot of what I end up experiencing is trying to figure out how am I negotiating what's happening at the school with my kids, especially as my older one gets older and the expectations and demands get higher. It infringes more and more on our home life. It infringes more and more on my parenting decisions. There has to be an effective interchange. And I don't think there is right now. And I especially don't think that we tend to talk about it as, hey, how do we have that effective interchange be more student-centered and have students, especially by the time they're at high school age, have their voices really actually helping to make the decision-making? I think we still tend to approach it as like, let's let all the adults come over here and we're going to have a conversation about what's best for you. And then we're going to maybe agree, usually not, try to implement it, fight with each other a whole bunch, and you don't get a vote. By the way, you're going to learn nothing because of that, because you got no vote. So you feel no autonomy. So you have zero motivation to learn anything. And so everything is just performative and you trying to escape. And it really bugged me the deeper that I looked into it, as you can probably tell from that little mini rant that I just went on.
No, it's good. Well, I think the other thing, this is something that we talk about in our Discord group sometimes with supporters. And that is, are we hearing the right kind of people? And, the group of students that you've talked with, they run the gamut of how they identify, their ethnicity, their gender identity, their race. I mean, in so many different ways, but also including things like you have 2 different homeschool students. And that's kind of a big portion of the book. You say, look, we need to be deeply listening to those who are experiencing the problem. And I'll be honest, that kind of hit me between the eyes when I read that, because I thought, here I am. We do this policy show. We have a whole sub channel on our Discord dedicated to these kinds of questions. And I am not sure I have ever once thought, well, maybe we ought to ask some people in that area. Are we? It's terrible. But I mean, that hit me right between my eyeballs. And so. So what are some of those stories that you see?
Yeah, I think so. Some of them were a real challenge directly for me. And I will admit that from my background, what prompted me to do that was actually less my formal training as a professor and more since I've entered the nonprofit space an unnamed number of years ago that I, again, won't specify because I feel self-conscious about my age, is that I started to learn more and more about participatory design. And the premises of that and how they can be really vital and effective at producing good products or services that people want, but also the ethics, the underlying ethics behind it of that have a lot more in relationship with sort of traditions with like disability rights advocacy and other groups, the kind of premise of like nothing about us without us. And so much of education totally violates that principle all the time. And so I had to set aside a lot of my own. I will admit, and as you know, because we've known each other for a long time and had lots of debates about it throughout the years, like I'm a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. I'm like, yeah, go public schooling, go teachers unions, go all of those types of things. And listening to students, actually listening to them about what made the difference for them really caused me to start questioning some of my own political beliefs. I'm still not coming over and voting libertarian with you. I'm just telling you right now, Trey, I'm not doing it. But, some of the student stories, so I was really deliberate in trying to make sure that we got a wide variety of students to talk to, and especially students who would have had experiences different than my own, because I wanted to make sure I was going to avoid my own confirmation biases. And so although students didn't necessarily want descriptions of, for instance, their income level to be included in the book, and I wanted them to be able to have the chance to decide what of their details were described, I had a deliberate range in the sort of socioeconomic status of the students that I was talking to as well.
Okay.
And some of the students that I spoke with were coming from backgrounds, so they were talking about how much they really valued and wanted to be able to have choices and how much it meant to them when they found ways to have choices that their families could not make economically viable for them. Right? They were not in families where the families could just be like, well, I'm just going to move districts to that district over there that has the such and such great thing, or move neighborhoods to the one that has the blah, 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 or get you in a private school, or have the resources even to be able to homeschool because of their job schedules. And so it made a really big difference to them when they could do something like choose a VOTEC, like charter-oriented school that allowed them to delve deeply into a subject area they loved and were really interested in. That I got to admit, like my first reaction to charter schools as a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat is to be like, oh, I feel a little queasy. But how many students really love that? It really put me kind of on my values in dialogue with each other, right? Because of the value of listening deeply to people who are actually experiencing the challenge and designing solutions with them against values that I have around the way that education should be open and not schools not be in a position where they can choose who their students are, right? I think that's one of the conflicts that I still sit with, with the book coming out that is not resolved at all in the book. Don't pick up the book thinking I've resolved that debate because I haven't. I still sit with that one going, what I think it is vital for schools not to be able to choose who they get. I think that automatically you end up creating multi-tier school systems that significantly perpetuate disadvantaging groups that are already disadvantaged. But the flip side of that choice is if students don't have a chance to make choices about the programs they're in and the schools they're going to and what is actually good fit for them, they lose out on 90% of the opportunity to feel motivated in their learning. And if you're not motivated in your learning, you're not retaining your learning. It's not sticking. It's sticking long enough for you to pass a test. And that's it. And then what are we investing in all of it for, right? If it's just to be a warehouse for people until they turn 18, that seems like a really dumb use of our tax dollars and not a good investment in what we want for citizenship and for workforce development and adulting in general.
Absolutely. I want to connect into a few of those things. So absolutely, there's several things I'd like to get in on that, but I want to start there. You said you haven't come all the way. You're not going to vote libertarian, and I hear that. Although I will admit, I've come over to your side a few times. I helped defeat Donald Trump, so I feel like you owe me one.
You personally, right?
Yeah, not the whole country, just you personally. But no, I do want to come back to that because this idea of choice is so central. But as you know, you've got some very different kinds of students who, so for example, you have students in the LGBTQ community who you might not think of as being individuals who would have needed that choice in the same way, but it was kind of liberating for them. Or you have Connor who talks about needing freedom and flexibility with oversight, right? Kind of this ability to do the things they want to do, or as you put it, I mean, you even have a chapter on freedom with boundaries. And so I guess my question then, I understand, and you just said, look, I don't completely resolve that question, but it does seem like that one of the broken things that you're kind of dealing with in the text is, hey, I can't fix the brokenness of a lack of educational choice in the system itself. And so what are the things I can do, even though I recognize that as broken? Am I getting that right?
Yes. Yeah, because the focus of this book was not for me to write a policy book. It was for me to write for the people who are in the midst of it right now. What are some options, some things you can think about, some things you can do, right? And so I wouldn't want your listeners to be like going to grab this book to be like, this is going to be an interesting policy book about these conflicts in education. It's not, but those themes and subtext are impossible to ignore when you start listening to student stories.
Yeah, because again, I mean, the premise of the book is here are these kind of systemic things that are broken. Your book makes some suggestions, some varied suggestions about that. But the primary thrust, of course, of the text is to say, okay, living inside of this, I don't have to just despair. What are some actual things I can do living in a non-optimal system? And I get that. But, so one of the things that I think about, so what I like about the text is at the end of each chapter, you have kind of this grab bag of here are things you can do. Here's some pragmatic suggestions for helping your student to do it. But you always break it up into you have things for parents and then you have things for teachers. But over and over again, as I take a look at some of your teacher recommendations, I can't help. You'd already brought up teachers unions a minute ago. But you say things like, well, you need to get to know your students individually, and you're going to assign portions of class time for this part. And I think, well, having education is right downstairs from me. I, as a matter of fact, used to be their dean. Right. I see some of those things and I go, that's a great suggestion, but you can't.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I recognize that you're not writing a policy book, but that portion of your book kind of screams policy to me. And so I'm curious about that. Especially, and again, I just to make it clear, right? There's several of those where I can hear, and again, you already mentioned, I can kind of hear there's a slight drumbeat in the background of teachers' unions going, no.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you deal with that here in the text in the book and in your own thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the way that I deal with it in the text in the book, you basically already described, right? It's meant to be a menu of ideas. You can pick what is feasible and applicable for you. And that's because I didn't want to shift the intent of, I wanted to keep student stories as the primary both medium and message of the book, is we should actually listen to and converse with students themselves more. And here's a chance to practice that, right? And at the same time, I knew that if there was not some more concretized practical tips, that it could feel really frustrating for readers. And so that's why the sort of end of each chapter has the okay, so if you're looking for stuff to do, what are things you might do? So that's the way that the book is handling, is to sort of say menu of options. Where do I land on it? If I had a policy wand to wave, then I would probably be waving it in the direction of, we need to stop focusing so much on this heavy what's measured gets treasured. And right now, what we measure is the heavy delivery of content. So teachers don't have the flexibility to say, hey, I'm going to go lighter on the amount of content I cover in order to make sure that learning is actually happening with the content that I do cover, right? We had the flexibility to make those kinds of choices more at the college level when we were teaching together, although we were seeing changes already happening in the state that were shifting some of that flexibility at the college level while we were there.
And again, I mean, we can be clear about that. That was Florida, right? I mean, and that's something we've talked about on the show before. There have been major changes, even since I've left, which was after you, where the ability to the content shifts as a result of state legislation, and we've covered that on the show. Right,
exactly. So it's that's changing even at the college and university level, depending upon the state that you're in, and the college or university system that you're in, and how much of it is receiving public funding, right? So there's changes happening there, but that's been the case in K-12 for a very long time, and has become more so and more so and more so with each kind of subsequent round of legislation. So yeah, if you talk with educators, they're going to say, I'm bound hand and foot. I've talked with some educators who are like, I don't even know, honestly, why I bothered being required to have a degree in education. My expertise is not respected ever. Not in a single day. Nowhere am I allowed to deploy the expertise and time that I spent developing in how to teach effectively, because everything is prescribed to me. These are the things I have to have on my walls. These are the things I have to say during the school day. This is the content that I have to cover for this amount of time. Somehow I'm supposed to also work in the ability to accommodate a range of student differences and differentiate instruction for their different needs, while having a certain classroom size and having certain requirements for the other things that I'm doing around metrics and recording and documentation. This is an impossible job. It's no wonder that education is one of the professions most inclined towards burnout. And it's no wonder that we're seeing a massive staffing issue and even pipeline issue when you look at the number of people that are going into graduate schools of education for K-12 education going forward. We are running out of rope from my perspective. And it's a big problem. And if we don't really tackle this and think about what's the function of education supposed to be, and how can we have things actually be aligned to that, we're going to have problems. In the meantime, there's like limited constrained things that students can do, families can do, and educators can do to make things better right now. And there might be more of them than people might realize. That was the hopeful element for me talking with young people, is that I have to admit, I came in being like, K-12 system is screwed. Well, I mean, I don't know. Whole thing's a lost cause. I don't even know. My kids are in it. I hate that they're in it. I don't have the financial ability to have them doing something else. But wow, what are we going to do with this? And I actually got more hope from talking with students than I expected, because they were illustrating more options kind of in the cracks and crevices of the existing system than I had realized were there. Yeah, I think there are places that are doing really cool stuff, in other words.
And I'll say, having known you a long time, I mean, this sounds funny, and it probably is a little bit funny, but your default position is not generally hope, and so.
Yeah,
I mean that to say, like, well, if this made you feel better, that must have been a positive thing out of these stories, right? I mean, again, that sounds like I meant that in a positive way. And so I do want to come back to some of these stories again of I struggle. So obviously we don't know everything. I don't know everything about them. Obviously you do. But when I take a look, you have a trans student, you have race students, and these are some of the forefront issues that schools are dealing with. And you have this one with Layla, where she talked about she was heading into college, and she talks about, quote, sometimes being the only Black girl in my engineering class, end quote, and how that really impacts her. And I think this is, again, one of those things that we think about in kind of broad strokes, but we don't think about it in terms of a student. And it was so funny, Becca, because I was reading that Layla quote. I have a student that I've really connected with here at OC. Obviously, we're a very different institution. But even here, where I know students really well, we were running, we were talking, and she's like, I'm really passionate about nursing, but I was just, and I said, well, what's the deal? Well, I'm Black. And I'm like, well, actually, how about I put you in contact with our Black professor? And so when I see some of these stories, I'm curious from your point of view, when we think about the trans student, when we think about the Black student, when we think about the ways that race, sex, gender intersect with education, what are the kind of stories that come out on how functioning in school? Because that was really interesting for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, listen, the reason that I'm going to piss off my liberal friends when they read the book is because they're going to feel like that I'm being too pro-charter. And the reason I'm going to piss off my Republican friends when they read the book is because they're going to feel like I'm being too pro, identity politics or whatever. And honestly, it's neither. It was just, I wanted to preserve the stories as students told them rather than superimposing my personal opinions about those things. I think that as I listened to the young people that were generous enough to share their time and their stories, and some of them are very heart-wrenching stories, honestly, I was really struck by how often these discussions that we have about, how do I put this, about what is okay to talk about, right? All the stuff in Florida where we both taught, right? What teachers can and can't talk about inside the classroom, or all these things that get kind of blown up into these big, framing it all as being about like parents' rights, and they want to, and I do, as a parent with kids in school, I sometimes do not appreciate some of the things that are being said to my kids in school, and I have to.
And sometimes some of the narratives even here
right?
that you give us are schools who are doing some kind of horrendous thing.
Yeah.
So at least from their point of view, right? From the student's point of view.
Exactly. From the student's point of view, obviously I didn't go out and do investigative reporting on each of the schools that they talked about to like discern the, exact facts behind their stories. So it's not that I'm just like, parents shouldn't have rights here. But the flip side, when you make all the conversations about that and about, well, what do I want my kids hearing about or not hearing about at school? I couldn't hear the stories from, like you talked about, from Layla or from Tuesday or from some of the other young people in the book and not be like, can we stop? Can we just stop making this so big and instead just think about, like, we care about people. We don't want young people in school, and instead of being able to focus on their learning, they're having to think about whether or not they're going to hear the 25th comment about their race or their body size or their sexuality or their gender expression, when they're just there trying to make sure they're able to take the pop quiz that's in their math class, or they're just trying to eat lunch and not have somebody make another joke about whether or not that's cat inside their meal because there's not many Asian students at the school. And so the students that are there think that's really funny. Could we just care about what that experience is like without having to get sucked back into the really polarized debates that we're having as a society right now about what can be talked about in school, and just pause and be like, is that what we want anybody's experience to be? Do we want anyone's experience inside school, a place that we think kids should be, to be the experience of being scared regularly or the experience of being isolated?
That was the word I wanted to get to. I'm so glad you said that, because that over and over again, I'm isolated. I mean, almost every student that you interview in some context points out on some dimension the feeling of isolation.
Yeah. And it's a particularly big deal to feel that way as an adolescent, because at that stage in brain development, you are primed for social orientation. You are primed for peer approval, far more so than adult approval. You are trying to figure out your identity in relation to your peers. And so the feeling of belonging matters to all of us as humans all the time, but it has a really heightened level of influence during our adolescent years.
Yeah, well, and this brings us to some, again, I'm always bringing stuff back to policy, and that's me, and I get it. But this week, we just had, as we're recording this, Republicans passed the foreign policy bills. But along with that, of course, was what you might think of as the partial or potential banning of TikTok. But that's also kind of a big portion of what these individual stories are about, and that's technology. And it's hard. it has long been a question of this. But of course, is it brand new or not? Is sitting right here in the public sphere as well? And it's funny how it seemed like from students' point of view, it was I can't not have this thing, but I recognize it's terrible. If I had to sum them kind of all up, or they're just kind of worried about like, I'm not even sure. I know that it's supposed to be terrible, even if I'm not positive, how it's being terrible to me. And that's another element that we see. I mean, again, in terms of we're worried about disinformation online, we're worried about news consumption on these kinds of big items. And so I'm curious about what your thoughts are there from these stories on technology and the intersection with schools.
Yeah. What's interesting is that I did not expect students to be talking about technology as much as they ended up talking about technology, because the questions we came in with were basically, what have been your most and least engaging learning experiences? Why? What made them that way? Right. So I wasn't coming in expecting to have students be talking about technology. I think part of that was a natural, logical result of the fact that as we were having those conversations, it was after many of students had come out of COVID lockdowns in their schools. And so the use of technology inside the classroom was probably more primed in their memory. But they even, they brought up social media, as you can see in the book, and it prompted me to then go do some more research myself after their interviews to learn more about what they were talking about, and was kind of scared, frankly, by the information that was available, and is why that section of the book has more kind of external research than the rest of the sections. I think it's the place where I feel most conflicted, because it seems like that there's pretty good evidence that a lot of the ways that tech and screens, and especially social media, are being used are harmful to that stage of brain development that adolescents are in. But also, as we know from, how terribly the Just Say No campaign went in the 80s, right? Or various other times we just try to like ban something for teenagers. Like, does that tend to work really well historically at getting the desired societal effect? There's not a great track record on that, right? There's not a great track record on abstinence-only education. There's not a great track record on just say no to drugs type drug education, right? Like, there's not a great track record on those types of approaches. And so if we just sweep in with that for tech, because we see all the issues it's creating, are we going to get the same kind of backfired result? I don't know. I think that one's really tricky. I kept it in there because it's top of mind for so many parents right now, and because the students were talking about it. I don't feel like that I have a satisfactory place to stand, even on my own, just as a parent, much less from a policy perspective, on how do we deal with this and the influence of tech on learning and on young people's brain development and on their sense of isolation, to tie back, because it gives this like candy feel, basically, of like, I want to feel a sense of belonging. Really easy way to do that is to go online and see how many people like or upvote or whatever thing I put there. And it's like eating candy when you're hungry instead of eating protein in a vegetable, right? It will give you the feeling of full.
As a matter of fact, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gives you the feeling of being full, but does not actually provide you the nutritional value that you need. And I think that's a real issue with education and learning in general, an increasing one, and one that we don't know how to navigate effectively as a society.
Well, I'm so glad that you ended up being kind of forced to deal with the technology section, because in part it almost feels like that is a microcosm for the larger issues you're talking about, right? When we were talking about like race and ethnicity, and you said you just want to be able to say like, stop. Why do we have to have these arguments over parents' rights versus these things? But it felt like this was kind of the perfect place because it's maybe a little bit less charged, but it illustrates that point, right? So we have, on the one hand, there's this kind of seemingly policy desire to have less technology in classrooms, and that sounds like bad when you say that, like, well, you want our kids to have, but you want to have more attention. You want them to be kind of engaged, and so this is something that, on the one hand, you have educational policy that wants to push you in this direction. But at the same time, how do we deliver all of our content? How are we going to do that is going to be through, as you note in the book, expanded uses of learning management programs. But other things, like I wasn't even aware of, like, well, you're going to need to be hooked into Instagram if you're going to know what's going to be going on with this particular club, or we're going to be sending out Slack messages so that you can keep up with band. just a couple of the ones you have in your book. And then so you have like schools with this kind of mixed potential message. But then you have parents with this mixed message. We were talking about this in the Discord. Just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal ran a piece entitled "Schools Want to Ban Phones, Parents Say No." And you dig into this, and this actually comes from some survey data, both locally and then nationally here just 2 days ago, as of our recording, where parents want to be able to contact their kids. And you think, oh, well, during the school day. No. They want to be able to contact their kids in class. As a matter of fact, you even have for families, one of your recommendations is reinforce the importance of having phones fully locked away during class times, because teachers can't compete with devices built to snare attention. But that whole, okay, parents sort of want this thing, but their actual beliefs are a different one. Schools kind of want one thing, but their beliefs are one. Again, it feels like the technology almost feels like a microcosm of all of the policy issues that we have here. So, what are the answers, if any, we're kind of getting from the students when we lean in and listen to their stories here that we might apply more broadly?
Yeah, this is one that I would like to do some deeper listening and delve into this topic more with more students, because it only came up where it came up. And so not every student that we talk to expressed something about this. And I would like to do more listening there. That said, I think that you're right, that there's a very big tension right now. And the issue to me is the tension between what is it that kids, I shouldn't say kids, the teenagers are not kids. They've advanced out of being kids. So what is it that young people are experiencing and wanting, and why? What is it that the schools are running into as challenges? And what is it that parents are wanting and why? And then I think there's going to have to be some reconciling between what I think is actually competing values, right? So I think parents want their kids to learn. They also want to be able to access their kids when they want to, right? Well, that's, I would say, a competition of values right now. Which is more important to you? Do you want your child to be able to learn, or do you want your child to be accessible to you whenever you're trying to figure something out or communicate with them? Because one is interfering with the other, right? I think the thing that I most admired when listening to young people talk about it is, I have to admit, I came in not realizing it, not with a conscious bias, but with a bias of like, yeah, well, of course, all young people are going to think that tech is great because they're all addicted to that tech and they love it. And like, teenagers are going to be like, yay, social media, yay, all the time. Oh, you boring old people who, don't use this stuff. And I was really surprised at the level of nuance. I don't know why I was surprised, because I'm always impressed with the level of nuance that young people, once you get to actually talking to them about something, express. But for some reason, I didn't think it was going to happen with tech, and I was dead wrong. And I was so glad to be dead wrong, because they're really thinking deeply about it. They are. They may not be talking deeply with their parents about it, but they are thinking deeply about this, in my experience, and they're noticing both their feeling of compulsion to want to use it, and then the feelings of ick when they use it, and then the times when they feel like they have no choice but to use it, because if they don't, they're not going to have access to the social networks, they're not going to have access to the clubs. I was horrified by some of the stories from some of the parents that I spoke with who were like, well, I try to take away my teen's smartphone, and I tried to at least prevent there being social media apps on their phone. But then I discovered that they can't participate, like you mentioned before, they can't participate in XYZ club unless they have Instagram to go up the volleyball team's activities on Instagram. It's part of the expectation of being part of that extracurricular sporting club. And I was like, what? Why are schools directly sponsoring this kind of activity when we know that social media is bad for teens? Like, what are we doing here? So I think that's the main thing, is that if we could have some more interesting conversations and direct conversations with young people, not just from this is bad for you, we're deciding for you how much of it you get, but really engaging deeply with like, what do you see the effects of this being? What do you see the effects of this being on your friends? How do you feel after XYZ, right? I think we'd be pleasantly surprised at the results of those kinds of conversations. And I think it's one of the areas we're most prone as adults to do a disservice to young people and assume that they're not capable somehow of thinking through what's actually a productive way to be engaging with technology in and outside of school.
So let me ask you kind of this broad question then, as we think about it, because I couldn't help this is something we do. We've had, we cover the Supreme Court cases on several months ago in the last term, talking about the extent to which schools can interfere, penalize students for what they do on off campus, but on their devices, right? I mean, that is at the edge of constitutional law right now. Again, listeners have listened to me and Ken talk about this. We talk about these issues of race and gender inside of and then now tech, and so this for me, and I recognize this. I'm biased, right? I get that. I mean, that's what I bring to this show is who I am, and this is one, and this isn't always popular, but I felt like your book was evidence, which was to say, I don't know if we can resolve these things through the legal mechanisms, through the policy channels that we normally do, because they are inherently about values in which we can't have, like, there's going to have to be winners and losers, but we can't, that doesn't work for education. And so for me, it made me say that, okay, again, I recognize that that was not your intention, but for me, I can't help but look at the totality of your book, look at the totality of these kiddos' messages, and say, I feel justified in suggesting that public education as it exists will never be able to fix these things because of its nature as public ed. And I say that even as somebody who is, I recognize I have a bias, and I'm not here trying to get rid of it, right? That's not my goal. Like I just said, I work with teachers on the regular. I want them to do good things. But for me, though, I cannot think of a universe in which we get a policy outcome for that fixes. I can't figure out, and so I'm curious about you on that front as well.
I'm laughing on the inside, Trey, trying not to laugh on the outside because of how weird my mic is. But because I'm like, are you just trying to trick me to finally, we've known each other for over a decade. You're like, listen, I have finally found the leverage point to get you to be libertarian about something, Becca. It's your own interviews that you have in your own book. I gotcha. You can't say no to that.
This is not a libertarian trap. It's something that we've even dealt with in the Discord, right? People keep asking me like, well, what should be the policy position? And I keep saying, I don't know. And the fact that I can't tell you makes me feel like this is not something I know how to make a policy about, right? Like, even we can disagree, Ken and I will disagree on the show. We disagree. But this is one where it's not even I have a policy disagreement. I just say, well, what do I do? And the answer is, I don't know. And ergo, that makes it feel like it feels like the institution itself must be a problem because it's not policy, it's a value. Exactly.
Right. Okay, so now you're making me second guess all kinds of things about myself because I'm like, well, what do I think the policy thing is? I also don't know, but I am not inclined to interpret my I don't know the same way that you interpret yours, right? So I think you're predisposed to interpret that I don't know to mean like, so it must not be a policy thing because as you own, your bias is to say lots of things shouldn't be policy things, right? Lots of things shouldn't be governmentally decided. My inclination when I look at the I don't know is to say, well, I think that I don't know because I'm recognizing that culturally our predispositions to how we make these kinds of decisions have not been getting us in a good place, which means we need to shift the fundamentals of what information we're turning to have the conversations and engage in these decisions. And to the degree that I want this book to have any impact on policy, if I were to pick one, I would hope that impact would just be back to that nothing about us without us, right? How often are we engaged in policy discussions and decisions on behalf of young people without having included them in the conversation in a meaningful or substantive way that is not tokenizing the way that Connor describes in the book with his sort of initial attempts to get involved with his school board and student voice? That is not real student voice. The way that he describes that of just being there to like basically give a student face to something, but not real decision-making, influence, and authority. That's not student voice. That's not real meaning. There are meaningful ways to involve young people. I know that they can't vote yet. I'm not trying to change laws around voting age in the country, but I do think that this is something that is occupying sometimes 70 to 80 hours of their week when you count all of the extracurriculars and the homework and the everything else. It's taking more time than our full-time jobs are. And we're not including them in the discussions and decisions about how it's going to work and what shapes it and even what it's for. Like, is it for workforce development? Is it for citizenship development? Is it just for being a safe warehouse for our kids until they're legally adults and have to go out and be responsible for themselves, right? Like, we don't even include them in discussions of that. I can tell you what the young people that I spoke with want it to be for. They don't want it to just be a warehouse. They don't want it to be based on outdated and obscure, well, this is what I had to learn, so this is what you have to learn. They want to actually believe that what they're learning is going to be relevant for their lives, either right now or very soon. And we don't know enough about what that is, especially at the rate of technological change and changes in the workforce. And so for us to be so confident that we know the right things for them to learn seems like nonsense to me. So anyways, I know we're getting close to time and I'm ending with a whole other can of worms, but I don't know how that's a policy decision other than to say, like, I think the policy should be we stop making policy decisions about education without the meaningful involvement of young people in those policy decisions.
I hear that. And I think that's an important one. And I can't help but sometimes, and, again, I know you're sympathetic for this one as well. It can feel similarly sometimes when you're on the teaching and the faculty side of that, right? Like, am I part of this conversation or am I just getting,
Yes.
And so I think maybe students and we have similar kinds of hits there. Well, again, Becca, thank you so much for being on the Politics Guys, and I hope you've had a good time.
Yeah, I've certainly had a great time. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to have an excuse to, record one of our rambling conversations rather than just having it off the books.
Well, I mean, we always record it. We just don't release it publicly. And that is all the difference in the world. But listeners, if you would like to grab the book, it is Can You Help Me Give A? And it is by Dr. Becca Block. And it is available at CanYouHelpMeGiveA. That's right, CanYouHelpMeGiveA.com, along with, as I understand it, some additional information and podcasts, correct?
Yep.
Okay, well, I hope that you guys get there. Now, before we finish, I just want to remind you that what makes this show possible is supporters. So we would love for you to become a supporter of the Politics Guys, because without you, I can't do things like interview Becca. So we get all kind of really cool things. You get this show and others without any kind of ads. You get support, access to our Discord group, things that I've talked about on the show. But hey, check it all out, and you're going to find it there. If you head to patreon.com/politicsguys, that's patreon.com/politicsguys, you can see what all those different levels of support will get you, and I encourage you to do that. There are other ways to support the show as well, where we're on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of those are in our links at the bottom, along with links to Becca's book. If you would like more information, you can head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, if you're in a position where you just financially can't do the midweek show, don't forget you can always reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com, and we can get you set up with that. Whether you support or not, we would really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on the podcast app of your choice, especially episodes like this where we're interviewing some really cool authors. Make sure to add us when you do that. If you've got questions, comments, corrections, gripes, or anything else you'd like to share, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also all over social media for those dopamine hits that you need on Facebook and X. You'll find those in the show notes. The amazing executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with another episode this weekend. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,